Hi everyone, welcome. As you can see out here on the bench, I've got a couple things all set to go to feed my worms. It's just some frozen kitchen scraps as well as a day's worth of coffee. And then in this little container I've got some pulverized eggshell, which is what I use as the grit for feeding my worms. And then here, sort of like the worm chow that I prepare on occasion, except this is just one of the ingredients that I usually use in my worm chow. Usually my worm chow includes some pulverized bird seed, in addition to a number of different other things, but this is nothing more than only pulverized bird seed. And, well, hopefully the worms like it. You know, yesterday I was in here to feed these two systems right up here, and yesterday this system had reached 300 days of age. I didn't realize that this system right here was only one day behind. This bin is now also 300 days of age. This is the one that I had in my sights for feeding today. And I think I'm going to follow suit with what I did on these two yesterday, which was to give them what I'm going to consider to be their last feeding, kind of taking them out of the everyday composting phase and enter what I refer to as foraging, which is just giving the worms time to break down whatever lingers in there as remaining bits and pieces of leftover bedding, leftover food, scraps, whatever. So I think that today on day 300, this system right here is going to get its final feeding as well. And then we're going to classify this one as now foraging as well. So let's get this thing up on the bench. We'll take care of getting it fed. You might have noticed the label on the side of the container makes reference to my compost barrel. And these are the worms that I enlisted from the material that was in my compost barrel. But since my compost barrel required repair a number of months ago, I had to empty it, and in the process I figured I would harvest the castings and enlist the worms that were in those castings to possibly come live indoors. So at first we thought about maybe not enlisting those worms to come join the indoor colony. We figured maybe they would just be returned back out to the compost barrel to make sure that the compost barrel has sufficient worms to continue doing its job after it gets repaired and put back into service. But I think as time went on, we sort of came to the realization that the compost barrel was doing pretty good and didn't really require the return of these worms to keep it going and to be productive. So after a while, we just decided that these worms are going to stay indoors and become part of the indoor wormery. So what I was attempting to lift off here was the coffee filter that had been placed right on top of the last feeding as our so-called feeding zone indicator. I'm not going to bother trying to restore this one to service after we're done today. This coffee filter will simply just get blended in as a little bit of supplementary bedding. I was even wondering if we might want to do the same with this piece of top covering newspaper, which is struggling to remain as a single piece of paper. It's just falling apart under its own weight. So yeah, maybe all that stuff can just go right back into the bin as sort of a foundation for today's feeding, because I didn't really intend to add any new bedding, but what we could do is we could just return those existing pieces of paper to the system to continue on as bedding near the feeding area. And then I guess I can just grab that coffee filter that came down with today's food portion to become the replacement feeding zone indicator. Just sort of gradually moving things around here to see how the last feeding reveals itself as I sort of gently excavate the material. It really does feel nice how this stuff all just crumbles apart, very loose, not too muddy, but still got a good moisture content to it. It was interesting, I did a quick review of the last video of this bin getting fed 2 weeks ago, 14 days ago. And it was then that I noticed that it had reached 284 days of age, and I'm thinking to myself, 284 plus 14 would equal 300. And it just so happened that today was 14 days since that last check-in. So I didn't really notice it until just either earlier today or yesterday, when I was sort of anticipating that this would be the next system that would be due for its next feeding. And then I realized that it would just happen to fall onto its day 300 birthday. I guess the other thing that I noticed too was how everything that was fed last time, as well as some of the leftovers that were returned to the feeding area last time. These were leftovers already at that time. These were little bits and pieces, I believe, we're still seeing of the cantaloupe rinds. But then I think the other stuff that they were fed last time were also items that were all starting with the letter C. And for the life of me, I just can't remember any of what those things were. Okay, now we're starting to get down into the feeding area, and I was kind of hoping that I might see some leftovers that would remind me what some of those food items were, starting with the letter C. I guess coffee would probably have been one of them, and chow, worm chow, would have been another one of them, and it wouldn't have been the cantaloupe, because it was the cantaloupe that was also one of the letter C's, but that was strictly a leftover item. So I'm just wondering if that one other food item that they received last time is going to occur to me before we get done here. If it does, I'll make mention of it. I think I will, while I'm editing this video, be compelled to go review the video from last check-in to refresh my memory on what that was exactly. Alright, so they've really done a number on the last feeding. There was a good number of pieces of paper towel thrown in here too, I was noticing, as we were feeding cabbage. It just came back to me. Cabbage and carrots. See that? I just had to think about the paper towel that was getting placed into the feeding, on top of which I ended up sprinkling that coleslaw mix. It was really just a coleslaw mix that had been sitting in the refrigerator a little bit too long, and it appeared to just be going bad. So I figured it was time to reclassify it as worm food. So all those bits of food, cabbage, carrots, coffee, chow, as well as the rinds of some cantaloupe, were all put in here. The cantaloupe rinds being leftovers last time already. This might be a piece of it right here. Were all the things that they were getting today. So I don't know if there's any sort of alphabetic pattern to today's feeding. But it's a variety of different stuff. You could see some stuff from the setup of a salad, some cucumber, some tomato, some stuff that came out of the preparation of a soup, such as the celery and these soup greens. And then there's even a big pile of lettuce. This is also from the preparation of the salad. So nice little portion to be fed today as their final feeding. But let's bring back some of this paper here. This piece of paper that had been top covering will serve as a nice little foundation onto which we could place today's foods. And from the look of it, based on how they nibbled through all that paper towel that was placed in here as part of the feeding last time, I got a feeling that newspaper is going to get gobbled up just the same. And I thought that the remains of the feeding zone indicator was floating out here somewhere on the top too, but it doesn't matter. Let's proceed with placing their food in here for them. The coffee will sprinkle in at the end. Let's start plopping in these butt ends of a couple heads of romaine lettuce, romaine hearts. And these are just the leaves that were sort of on the top of each of those heads of lettuce that looked a little bit too dark. Figured I'd chop that off and include it in the feeding too. So most of this is stuff that was part of the salad I made the other day. There are just a couple little things in here which were out of another container. Some soup greens. So it's a nice final feeding for this system on day 300. And on top of the food is usually where I place the grit. And for a system that's this old, that's probably already had a couple dozen feedings, many of which probably already included grit, it might not be that terribly important to include grit, but every now and then I just like to do away with some of the eggshell that keeps accumulating around here, so I figured let's just include grit with today's final feeding as well. Okay, another thing that I usually like to combine with the coffee so that it just doesn't end up becoming a big pile of boring stuff on the top is the worm chow. So why did I use my clean hand? This is the hand that I usually try to keep clean so I can handle the camera and things. But whatever. I guess I wasn't paying very close attention. So this pulverized birdseed looks kind of cool. All bite-sized stuff. And this jar was almost full about a week ago. I've been applying it pretty much everywhere in each of my feedings. And my hope is that the worms are digging it. I don't even know if I've made it all the way around back to the first system that was fed with that stuff right after I made that batch. Once I get back to that first system that got some of it, we'll be able to see how they did. Here we go. Here's that feeding zone indicator that the worms have pretty much chewed through. And here's like a leftover piece of banana stem. And we might bump into some other little bits and pieces of leftovers in here as we plow through. I guess before we cover up though, I usually like to also peek down into the outer edges of each of these worm bins when I'm in here to look at how things are doing, just to make sure things are in good shape. It does seem to me like things out here are a bit dry. I mean, I could see a worm or two hanging out. Certainly not the end of the world, but still. Perhaps because of the material being a little bit dry on the outskirts, maybe that's the reason we saw so many huddled around the food. Maybe not even so much because of their interest in the food supply being there, but maybe more about the fact that the majority of the system's moisture appears to be down around the middle where the foods have been getting applied. I mean, as you saw in the beginning, there is a piece of bubble wrap plastic covering this thing to try to prevent undue evaporation from allowing the system's moisture level to drop to any sort of a dangerous level. And I don't think we're at that point where, you know, we'd be approaching any sort of a dangerous level. So I'm not going to worry too much about it. In fact, if we're going to be harvesting this system at some point in the near future, the more dry and the more flaky the material is, the better, I believe. So I think we're just going to let it ride just the way it is. Let's just go ahead and put this coffee filter right on top where we last fed. Oh, got a worm trying to sneak out here. Let's make sure our worms stay in the bin. And, you know, even though we had a top covering piece of newspaper draped out here on the top previously, which has now been recycled as bedding as part of the feeding, I think the time has come to just skip adding new stuff and just let the worms have at what exists in there and let them work on that stuff. So, yeah, I think this is going to work out pretty nicely. All right, well, that was a nice little check-in with the compost barrel worms. And my guess is that, you know, if these guys get harvested with that other batch of worms, I'm not going to keep classifying these as the worms from the compost barrel harvest. I keep coming up with these little categories and distinctions between the worms that were from here and the worms that did that, and da-da-da-da. So I think these guys will just get folded in with all the rest of the worms and just get classified as generic red wigglers, and then they'll really be part of the in crowd. All right, everyone, that's it for today's video. Hopefully you enjoyed it. As always, if you did, please don't forget to leave me a quick thumbs up before you go. That's always very much appreciated. And if you haven't done so already, please also consider subscribing to the channel. All right, everyone, have a great day. Thanks for watching. Bye-bye.